December 1942. The world was on fire, and Australia sat at the edge of the flames. Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific Ocean like a deadly wave, crushing everything in their path. Singapore had fallen. The Philippines had fallen. The Dutch East Indies had fallen. For 6 months, the Japanese military machine had rolled forward without stopping, and now Australia faced the very real threat of invasion. Every Australian knew the enemy could arrive any day. In cities like Sydney and Melbourne, air raid sirens screamed through the night. Families huddled in bomb shelters, listening to the wailing sounds that warned of possible attack. The government had imposed strict rationing. Sugar, butter, meat and tea were carefully measured and distributed. Every scrap of metal was collected for the war effort. Every able-bodied man who could hold a rifle had been sent to fight. The women worked in factories, building weapons and ammunition. Children collected newspaper and rubber for recycling. Australia was a nation at war, using every resource it had to survive. The political situation was desperate. Prime Minister John Curtin publicly declared that Australia looked to America for help, essentially admitting that Britain could no longer protect its distant colony. This was a shocking statement that changed Australia's place in the world forever. The social fabric was stretched thin. Neighbours reported neighbours for hoarding food. Propaganda posters covered every wall, showing cruel caricatures of Japanese soldiers with exaggerated features, calling them subhuman monsters. The message was clear. The enemy was not like us. They were savage, cruel, and incapable of mercy. Japanese soldiers received the same propaganda, only reversed. From the moment they entered military training, young men like Sergeant Yoshio Nakano were taught the code of Bushido. This ancient warrior code said that surrender was the ultimate shame. Death was honourable. Capture was disgrace worse than any wound. Their officers drilled this message into them every single day. They were told that enemy soldiers, especially white soldiers from places like Australia and America, were weak and soft. They were also told these enemies were barbaric demons who would torture Japanese prisoners in unspeakable ways. Nakano believed every word. He had grown up in Hiroshima, a beautiful city near the sea. His father was a shopkeeper who sold rice and vegetables. His mother made traditional clothing. He attended school where teachers praised the emperor as a living god. When he turned 18 in 1940, joining the military was not a choice, but an expectation. Every young man served. It was the highest honour a family could receive. His training was brutal. Officers beat soldiers who made mistakes. Food was scarce, even in training camps. Rice mixed with barley made up most meals. Sometimes they got a small piece of fish. Nakano learned to shoot a rifle, throw grenades, and charge with a bayonet. But more than physical training, they received constant ideological instruction. Japan was superior. The emperor was divine. Dying for Japan meant eternal glory. Surrendering meant eternal shame that would follow a soldier's family for generations. In early 1942, Nakano shipped out to New Guinea as part of the force meant to capture Port Moresby and eventually invade Australia itself. The jungle was hell. Disease killed more men than bullets. Malaria ravaged entire units. Supplies never came. The rations dropped to one small ball of rice per day. Men ate bark and insects to survive. Then came the battle at Milne Bay in September 1942. It was Japan's first major land defeat of the war. Australian forces, fighting desperately on their own doorstep, pushed back the invasion. Nakano's unit was decimated. He watched friends die in the mud. He saw the unstoppable Japanese army stop cold. And then, wounded and separated from his unit, he faced the choice: die fighting or surrender. He chose surrender, and the shame crashed over him like a physical weight. He had violated everything he believed in. His ancestors would be dishonoured. His family would be humiliated. His father's shop would be marked with shame. According to everything he had been taught, he should have used his last bullet on himself. But he didn't. He raised his hands and let the Australian soldiers take him. The transport to the prisoner of war camp was a blur. Nakano expected execution at any moment. He had heard stories about what happened to prisoners: torture, beheadings, starvation. The propaganda had been clear. White soldiers were cruel savages who enjoyed causing pain. Every bump in the road, every stop, he thought, would be his last moment alive. Instead, the Australian soldiers gave him water. They bandaged his wounds. They didn't beat him or spit on him. This confused Nakano more than anything. Were they saving him for worse torture later? Was this some kind of psychological trick? The truck finally arrived at Cowra, a prisoner of war camp in New South Wales, about 200 miles west of Sydney. The camp sat on flat land with mountains visible in the distance. Barbed wire fences surrounded the compound. Guard towers stood at each corner. Inside the fence, rows of wooden barracks stretched in neat lines. The camp held 2,223 Japanese prisoners, all men who had made the same shameful choice Nakano had made. He was processed, given a number, and assigned to a barracks. The other prisoners barely looked at him. They all carried the same shame, the same dishonour. Speaking about it made it worse, so they said nothing. They moved through the camp like ghosts, waiting for whatever fate the Australians had planned for them. Then, on his third day, something happened that made no sense at all. An Australian guard approached Nakano while he stood in the exercise yard. The guard was young, maybe 25, with sun-weathered skin and a relaxed posture that seemed wrong for someone guarding dangerous enemy prisoners. He was smiling. The guard carried a wooden bat and a red leather ball. He gestured toward an open field inside the compound and said something in English that Nakano didn't understand. Then the guard mimed a throwing motion and a swinging motion, still smiling, clearly inviting Nakano to play some kind of game. Nakano stood frozen, his mind unable to process what was happening. This was the enemy. This was supposed to be his torturer. But the guard was inviting him to play. Why? Minutes later, he found himself holding the strange wooden bat, watching as the Australian guard demonstrated how to swing it. The guard's name was Private Morrison, though Nakano would not learn this for several weeks. Morrison positioned himself about 20 yards away and threw the red leather ball toward Nakano in a gentle arc. It bounced once before reaching him. Nakano swung awkwardly and missed. Morrison laughed, but it was not a cruel laugh. It was the kind of laugh you share with a friend who is learning something new. He jogged over, adjusted Nakano's grip on the bat and tried again. This time, Nakano made contact. The ball rolled a few feet. Morrison clapped and gave him a thumbs up. Over the next 3 days, more prisoners joined these strange cricket sessions. The guard seemed genuinely happy to teach them. They explained the rules slowly, using hand gestures and simple words. Cricket made no sense to Nakano at first. Why hit the ball and then run back and forth? Why did the bowler try to hit wooden sticks behind the batter? But slowly he began to understand. More importantly, he began to notice something impossible. The guards treated them like human beings, not prisoners, not shameful deserters, just people learning a game. The real shock came at mealtime. The first breakfast at Cowra left Nakano staring at his tray in disbelief. 2 eggs, fried and still hot. 3 strips of bacon, crispy and glistening with fat. 2 slices of bread with real butter. A cup of milk. A cup of tea with sugar. He picked up the tray, thinking there had been a mistake, that this was meant for the guards. But no, every prisoner received the same amount. Nakano sat on his bunk and calculated in his head. This single breakfast contained more protein and calories than he had eaten in an entire week in New Guinea. His hands shook as he ate. Lunch brought more impossibilities. A thick stew with chunks of beef, carrots and potatoes. The beef alone, tender and plentiful, was something he had not tasted in over a year. In Japan, even before the war, meat was expensive and rare. Here it appeared in the pot like it was nothing special. The portions were huge. A man could fill his belly completely. Some prisoners could not finish their meals because their stomachs had shrunk from months of starvation. Nakano began keeping a mental record. He estimated each prisoner received about 3,600 calories per day. Fresh meat appeared on their plates 3 times every week. Vegetables were not wilted or rotten, but crisp and colourful. Bread came from an industrial kitchen that produced hundreds of loaves daily using mechanical mixers and large ovens. The kitchen itself was a marvel. When prisoners were assigned to work details there, Nakano saw the scale of the operation. Massive refrigeration units kept food fresh. These were not simple ice boxes, but electrical cooling systems that hummed constantly. Nothing spoiled. Nothing was wasted through poor storage. By comparison, Japanese frontline troops were receiving roughly 2,400 calories per day when supply lines functioned properly. Often, they received far less. Nakano remembered eating rice mixed with so much barley that it barely held together. He remembered the single dried fish shared among 5 men. He remembered chewing on leather boots to have something in his stomach. Yet here, as prisoners, as defeated and disgraced men, they ate better than the soldiers still fighting for the emperor. The camp canteen opened on Saturdays. Nakano walked inside expecting nothing, but found shelves stocked with items he thought had vanished from the world. Chocolate bars wrapped in colourful paper, cigarettes by the carton, bottles of beer, cold from refrigeration, writing paper and pencils, soap that smelled like flowers, small toys and games. Prisoners could purchase these items using credits they earned from work details. The prices were reasonable. The guards who ran the canteen were polite and patient, even when language barriers made transactions difficult. Nakano bought a bar of chocolate. It cost him 2 days' worth of work credits. He sat on his bunk that night and broke off 1 square at a time, letting it melt on his tongue. Chocolate, real chocolate. He had not tasted it since before the war. In Japan, such luxuries had disappeared years ago. Everything went to the war effort. Citizens accepted constant sacrifice as their duty. Yet Australia, supposedly struggling and threatened with invasion, had chocolate in prison camp canteens. The contrasts kept multiplying. Guards provided tools, lumber and seeds for prisoners who wanted to build gardens. Nakano watched as men from his barracks constructed an elaborate Japanese garden with a small pond, carefully arranged rocks and a wooden bridge. They grew vegetables and flowers. The guards never questioned why prisoners needed such things. They simply provided what was requested. Some prisoners built furniture, others carved wooden sculptures. The camp allowed creative expression that had been forbidden in the Imperial Army. Where every moment served military discipline, the camp library held over 600 books in Japanese. Nakano spent hours there, reading novels and poetry he thought he would never see again. How did the Australians obtain so many Japanese books? Who organised this? Why did they care if prisoners had something to read? Educational classes were offered 3 times per week. Australian teachers, some of them university students before the war, taught English and agricultural techniques. They used blackboards, textbooks, and actual teaching methods. They answered questions patiently. They treated the prisoners like students, not like enemies who deserved nothing but punishment. When Private Hajime Toyoshima collapsed during morning exercises, clutching his stomach and screaming in pain, the response was immediate. Guards called for medical transport. An ambulance arrived within 15 minutes. Toyoshima was taken to the camp hospital where an Australian military surgeon diagnosed appendicitis. They operated that same afternoon. Nakano heard about it from other prisoners who worked in the hospital. The surgeon used the same techniques, the same care, the same quality of medicine that he would use on Australian soldiers. Toyoshima recovered fully within 2 weeks. This fact settled into Nakano's mind like a stone dropping into deep water. They saved a prisoner's life. They used expensive medicine and a trained surgeon's time on a man who had been trying to kill Australians just weeks earlier. The Imperial Army did not even provide this level of care to its own soldiers unless they were officers. Nakano began watching the trucks that delivered supplies to the camp each week. He counted them. 3 large trucks every Tuesday and Friday. They carried crates of food, medical supplies, building materials, and mail. The trucks themselves were well maintained, painted, and running smoothly. The drivers were friendly, sometimes sharing cigarettes with the guards. This was not an army on the brink of collapse. This was not a nation struggling to survive. This was abundance that Japan had never known, even at the height of its power. The technological gap became undeniable. Electric lights in every building, running water, hot and cold, flush toilets, refrigeration, mechanical kitchen equipment, trucks and ambulances that always had fuel. These were not luxuries in Australia. They were normal, expected, standard. Japan had fought to build an empire, claiming it needed resources and territory to become a modern industrial power. Yet here was Australia, a nation with fewer people than Tokyo, demonstrating industrial capacity that exceeded anything Nakano had seen in Japan. Something fundamental was beginning to crack in his understanding of the world. The breaking point came on Christmas Day, 1943. Nakano had been at Kaura for 14 months. He understood cricket now. He could hold basic conversations in English. He worked in the camp garden, growing vegetables that reminded him of home. But he still carried the shame of surrender like a physical weight on his shoulders. He still believed, somewhere deep inside, that Japan's spiritual superiority would eventually overcome material disadvantages. The propaganda had been too strong, too constant, to fade completely. Until Christmas. The day started normally. Morning roll call, breakfast of eggs and toast, work assignments posted on the board. But then the guards began decorating. They strung coloured lights along the barracks. They brought in a pine tree 10 feet tall and set it up in the main courtyard. Prisoners gathered to watch as guards hung ornaments and tinsel on the branches. A star went on top. Nakano had heard of Christmas from his English classes, but had never seen it celebrated. The tree glittered in the summer sunlight. December in Australia meant heat, not snow, which seemed strange for a winter holiday. At noon, the guards announced a special meal. Prisoners lined up at the dining hall, unsure what to expect. The smells hit them first. Roasted meat, fresh bread, something sweet and rich. The serving line revealed the impossible. Each prisoner received a full plate of roasted turkey, the meat tender and juicy. Mashed potatoes with real butter melting into them. Gravy, thick and brown. Stuffing made with bread and herbs. Green beans, cranberry sauce, sweet and tart. A roll with more butter. For dessert, a slice of plum pudding with custard sauce. Nakano sat at the long wooden table with his plate in front of him. He stared at the food. This was a feast. Not just adequate rations, not just sufficient calories. This was abundance, meant to celebrate, to bring joy, to mark something important. And they were serving it to prisoners, to men who had fought against them, to enemies who had killed their brothers and friends. He picked up his fork and took a bite of turkey. The flavour exploded in his mouth. It was perfectly cooked, seasoned with salt and pepper and herbs he could not name. He ate slowly, making each bite last. Around him, other prisoners did the same. Some had tears running down their faces. They were not crying from sadness, but from the overwhelming confusion of being treated this way. After the meal, Captain Patterson, the camp commander, stood up to address the prisoners. An interpreter translated his words into Japanese. Patterson was a tall man with grey hair and a calm manner. He had run the camp since it opened and treated his job seriously, but without cruelty. He began speaking, and Nakano listened to the translation carefully. Patterson said he knew this was a difficult time for everyone. He acknowledged that the prisoners were far from home, separated from families, uncertain about the future. He said that despite the war, despite the fact that they were on opposite sides, he wanted them to know something important. They were still human beings. They still deserved dignity. They still deserved to be treated with basic decency. He expressed hope that one day the war would end, and all of them, guards and prisoners alike, would return home safely to their families. He wished them all a Merry Christmas. The words hit Nakano like a physical blow. Dignity, decency, humanity. These were not words the Imperial Army used about prisoners. Enemy prisoners were not human. They were things to be used or destroyed. Nakano had been taught this his entire military life. He had believed it without question. Yet here was an enemy commander speaking to Japanese prisoners as if they mattered, as if their lives had value beyond military utility. After Patterson finished speaking, guards began distributing gifts, small wrap packages, one for each prisoner. Nakano unwrapped his with trembling fingers. Inside he found a chocolate bar, 3 sheets of writing paper with envelopes, and a small wooden carving of a kangaroo. The kangaroo had been carved by hand, smoothed and polished. Someone had spent time making this. Someone had crafted a small toy for enemy prisoners to mark a holiday. Nakano turned the wooden kangaroo over in his hands. The detail was remarkable. The ears, the powerful back legs, the long tail. Whoever made this cared about doing it well. This was not mass-produced. This was personal. Some Australian soldier had sat somewhere, maybe in a guard tower during a quiet shift, and carved animals for Japanese prisoners. Why? What possible reason could there be? That night, Nakano lay on his bunk, unable to sleep. The other men in his barracks were quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Nakano had hidden a small notebook under his mattress for months. He kept it secret because writing down doubts felt like another betrayal. But tonight he pulled it out and began writing by the dim light from the window. He wrote, "We were taught that Australians were barbaric white demons who would torture us. We were told they were weak and soft, that their love of comfort made them poor soldiers. We were promised that our spiritual strength would overcome their material advantages. Everything we believed was a lie." He paused, the pencil shaking in his hand. Then he continued, "They treat us better than our own officers treated us in barracks. In the Imperial Army, officers beat soldiers for small mistakes. Food was always scarce. Comfort was seen as weakness. We were told this hardship made us strong, but here the Australians give us good food, medical care, education, and recreation. They do this even though we are their enemies. And they are not weak. They defeated us in battle. Their soldiers fight hard and well. Their nation produces more than we ever could." The crack in his worldview became a chasm. He wrote faster now, the words pouring out. How can this be? How can they have material abundance and human dignity? We were told these things were opposites. We were told that spiritual purity required rejection of material comfort. We were told that treating people kindly made them soft. But the Australians proved this is false. They have abundance, and they are not weak. They have kindness, and they are not soft. Everything we believed about the superiority of our way was propaganda. He stopped writing and stared at the words. Seeing them on paper made them real in a way that thinking them did not. He had admitted the truth. Japan had lied to him. The military had lied to him. The emperor, who he had been taught was a living god, had sent millions to die for a war that could never be won. Not because Australian or American soldiers were better fighters, but because the gap in industrial capacity and technological development was too vast to overcome with spirit and courage alone. The propaganda had always talked about Yamato Damashie, the Japanese spirit, as if it were a weapon that could defeat tanks and planes. But spirit could not manufacture trucks. Courage could not build refrigeration systems. Loyalty to the emperor could not create the abundance that let Australia feed prisoners better than Japan fed its own troops. The cherry blossoms and warrior codes that Tokyo praised so highly were beautiful poetry, but they could not compete with the reality of nations that had embraced industrial modernization, democratic values, and systems that treated human life as valuable. Nakano realized something else, something that made his stomach turn. The very act of treating prisoners well demonstrated greater strength, not weakness. It took power to show mercy. It took confidence to treat enemies with dignity. The Imperial Army executed prisoners because it feared them, because it could not afford to feed them, because its system was brittle and cruel. Australia fed and educated prisoners because it could afford to, because its values demanded it, because its system was resilient and wealthy. He looked at the wooden kangaroo sitting on the shelf beside his bunk. That small carved toy represented everything his military training had failed to prepare him for. The enemy was not supposed to be kind. The enemy was not supposed to care. The enemy was not supposed to demonstrate that there was a better way to organize society, a way that produced both power and humanity. Nakano closed his notebook and hid it again. He lay back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow he would wake up and work in the garden. He would eat good food. He would maybe play cricket. He would live another day as a prisoner who had discovered that everything he fought for was built on lies. The war would continue. Men would keep dying. But Nakano now understood that they were dying for nothing, for a vision of the world that could never compete with the reality he lived every single day at Kaura. September 1945. The war was over. Japan had surrendered after 2 atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. Nakano heard the news while standing in the Kaura camp yard. An interpreter read the emperor's radio address aloud. For the first time in history, the Japanese people heard their god's voice, and he told them they had lost. Some prisoners wept. Some sat in stunned silence. A few tried to kill themselves, unable to accept the shame of defeat. Nakano felt only numbness. He had known for months that Japan would lose. The gap between what propaganda promised and what reality delivered had become too obvious to ignore. The repatriation process took weeks. Australian officials processed paperwork, organised transport ships, and prepared thousands of prisoners for the journey home. On his last day at Kaura, Private Morrison found Nakano in the garden where he had spent so many hours working. Morrison carried the cricket bat they had used for their first game nearly 3 years earlier. He held it out to Nakano and said in simple English, "For you, remember us." Nakano took the bat, running his hands over the smooth wood. He tried to find words, but his English failed him. He bowed deeply instead, holding the bow longer than necessary, trying to communicate gratitude that went beyond language. Morrison smiled, patted his shoulder, and walked away. Nakano boarded the transport ship with the cricket bat tied to his small pack. The voyage across the Pacific took 2 weeks. The ship was crowded with former prisoners, all heading back to a country they barely recognized. They received news during the journey. Japan had been devastated. Cities were rubble. Millions were dead. The emperor remained alive, but had renounced his divinity. American forces occupied the country. Everything had changed. The ship docked at Kure, a port city near Hiroshima. Nakano stood on deck as Japan came into view. The harbour was filled with sunken ships, their masts poking above the water like grave markers. Buildings along the waterfront were collapsed or burned. No one came to greet them. No cheering crowds. No military band. Just a few tired officials checking names on lists and pointing toward trains that would take them further inland. Nakano had one destination in mind: home, Hiroshima. He caught a train that crawled along damaged tracks, stopping frequently for repairs or debris clearing. Other passengers were silent, their faces hollow with exhaustion and grief. When the train finally reached Hiroshima Station, Nakano stepped onto the platform and froze. The city was gone, not damaged, not partially destroyed. Gone. As far as he could see, there was nothing but flattened rubble and ash. A few concrete buildings remained standing, their walls scorched black, but everything else had been erased. The atomic bomb had created a wasteland where a city of 350,000 people once lived. Nakano walked through streets he no longer recognized. There were no landmarks. No familiar shops. No temple where his family had celebrated New Year. Nothing remained. He found the neighborhood where his father's shop had been. It was now a field of debris, broken bricks, twisted metal, ash and dust. He dug through the rubble with his bare hands, looking for anything familiar. He found nothing. No trace of his father's shop. No sign of the apartment where he had grown up. No clue what happened to his family. A woman passing by stopped and watched him dig. She looked ancient, though she might have been 40. Radiation sickness and starvation had aged everyone. She asked who he was looking for. Nakano told her his family name. Her face fell. She knew them. His father had been in the shop when the bomb fell. Instant death, she thought, though no one could be certain. His mother had been visiting relatives in the countryside and survived. She was now living in a refugee camp 30 miles north. Nakano thanked her and began walking. 30 miles. His legs were strong from 3 years of regular meals and exercise at Koira. He could make the distance. He walked through the atomic wasteland carrying his Australian cricket bat. The contrast hit him with every step. While he had eaten turkey dinners in Australia, this had happened. While he had played cricket on green fields, his city had been vaporized. While guards had given him chocolate and carved toys, his countrymen had burned alive in atomic fire. He reached the refugee camp after 2 days of walking and sleeping in abandoned buildings. The camp was a sprawl of tents and shacks housing thousands of displaced people. He asked for his mother's name at the camp office. A tired clerk checked a list and pointed toward a tent in the eastern section. Nakano walked there slowly, afraid of what he would find. His mother sat outside a small tent, mending clothes with thread that had been used and reused so many times it was barely holding together. She had aged 20 years. Her hair was completely grey. Her hands shook. When she looked up and saw him, she dropped the clothes and began to cry. Not tears of joy, but tears of relief that at least one member of her family had survived. They embraced without speaking. What words could capture this? Over the following days, his mother told him what had happened. His father, dead in the blast. His younger brother, killed fighting in the Philippines. His sister's husband, dead at Okinawa. His sister survived with 2 small children, now living in another camp 50 miles away. The family had been destroyed. The city had been destroyed. The country had been destroyed. And for what? For an empire that lasted barely 15 years before collapsing into atomic ash. Nakano showed his mother the cricket bat. She looked at it with confusion. He tried to explain where it came from, what it represented, but the gulf between his experience and hers was too vast. How could he tell her that the enemy had treated him better than his own military? How could he explain that he had lived in abundance while she starved? How could he make her understand that everything they had been taught about the war was a lie? He stopped trying. Some truths were too cruel to speak aloud. He found work helping to clear rubble in Hiroshima. The American occupation forces paid workers in rice and canned goods. Nakano used his English skills, learnt in Kaura's educational classes, to communicate with American soldiers. They were surprised to meet a Japanese veteran who spoke their language. Some were friendly, others kept their distance, not sure how to treat former enemies. Nakano did not blame them. He had killed their countrymen. They had killed his. The war had made everyone into murderers. Months passed. Japan began the slow process of rebuilding. The American occupation brought food, medicine, and new ideas. Democracy, women's rights, labour unions, educational reform, land redistribution. General MacArthur was remaking Japan in America's image, and most people accepted it because the old way had led only to destruction. Nakano watched this transformation with mixed feelings. His country had lost everything, but maybe that loss would force Japan to become something better. He eventually became an English teacher at a school that reopened in 1947. He taught students who had grown up during the war, children who remembered only propaganda and sacrifice. He taught them English, but more importantly, he taught them that the world was larger and more complicated than Japanese nationalism had claimed. He told them about Australia, about cricket, about guards who treated prisoners with dignity. He did not tell them about the shame of surrender. He told them about the value of human life. He married in 1948. His wife was a widow whose husband had died at Guadalcanal. They understood each other's losses without needing to explain. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Nakano raised them with different values than he had learned. He taught them that honour was not found in death, but in how you lived. He taught them that strength meant building, not destroying. He taught them that treating others with kindness was not weakness, but the highest form of courage. The cricket bat stayed with him for the rest of his life. He mounted it on the wall of every apartment and house he lived in. His children asked about it. He told them the story, simplified for young ears, about how enemies became people when you saw them as human beings. When his son asked why the Australians were kind, Nakano said, because their society was built on values that included everyone, even enemies. They had enough for themselves and enough to share. That is real power. Nakano lived until 1989, long enough to see Japan become an economic miracle, a peaceful democracy, and a close ally of the nations it once fought. In his final years, his grandson interviewed him for a school project about the war. The grandson asked what he learned as a prisoner. Nakano thought for a long time before answering. I learned that everything I believed about strength was backwards, he said. We thought poverty made us tough. We thought cruelty made us strong. We thought dying was honourable. But the Australians showed me that true strength comes from abundance shared fairly, from treating people with dignity, from building a society where even your enemies are seen as human. That cricket bat on the wall represents the most important lesson of my life. The side that treats human life as valuable will always defeat the side that throws life away. After Nakano died, his grandson donated the cricket bat to the Kaura POW Camp Museum, which had been established to preserve the history of the camp. It sits in a glass case now, with a small plaque explaining its story. Thousands of visitors see it each year. Some are Australian, some are Japanese, some are tourists from around the world. The plaque reads, "True strength lies not in the willingness to die, but in the wisdom to choose how we live and how we treat others, even in our darkest hours."